The premise is quite simple and quite beautiful, is I do not have the truth at the beginning of the dialogue, and neither do you. But we have different positions, and these different positions will eventually come together to a higher level of understanding.
Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Education Matters podcast. When I first imagined this series, I envisioned it as a space for authentic conversations, the kind I've had over the years with colleagues, educators, and friends. Now, more than ever, authenticity feels essential. We're living in a time where AI-generated content and deepfakes will continue to flood the media landscape. Add to this the confusion of well-intended but misinformed perspectives, and it's pretty clear. Those of us committed to building genuine communities and sharing meaningful ideas have a responsibility to create work that is honest and real. That's why I'm especially proud to begin this podcast series with a conversation that's deeply personal. My first guest is not only my greatest influence in learning and education, but also my father, Mauro Buccheri. Mauro is Professor Emeritus, having spent 39 years teaching and researching in the Department of Languages, Literature, and Linguistics at York University in Toronto. Born in 1949 in a small town near Syracuse, Sicily in Italy, his life has been shaped by the immigrant experience, first moving to Venezuela as a 5-year-old, and then eventually back to Sicily, and finally settling in Toronto in the early 1970s. There, he became an active voice in local politics, particularly within the Italian immigrant community. As you'll hear, these experiences, primarily rooted in poverty, have profoundly shaped his outlook on education and life. Although his PhD was in Italian literature, with a focus on the Italian modernist novelist Italo Svevo, Mauro's academic interests have always been interdisciplinary. He studied the adjacent fields of sociology, philosophy, and economics, and has even seriously studied the depths of the sciences, including biology, evolutionary psychology, and physics. For those who know him well, however, it's just not his erudition that stands out, but his deep empathy, what he himself would call his humanity. Over the years, I've heard countless stories from his former students about how he taught with passion and knowledge. Yet more than anything, they remember how much he cared for them, a quality that defines every truly great teacher. In our conversation, you'll hear that same compassion come through. While Dad has always been drawn to ideas and the search for new perspectives, his guiding principle has been to use those ideas to benefit others, to deepen our democracy, strengthen our commitments to one another, and pursue the collective good. In this conversation, you'll catch glimpses of his humanist reading of thinkers like Marx and Socrates and his insistence on the necessity of civic engagement for a meaningful life. We also touch on the importance of a liberal arts education in shaping good citizens, the value of critical thinking, the funding crisis in Canadian universities, and other topics. I can't promise that this interview fully captured Dad's vast erudition. It's hard to distill a lifetime of thought into a single hour of conversation. But I do hope it conveys his character, because character is really at the heart of education. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Mauro Buccheri, a living example of a thoughtful and engaged citizen. Okay, Professore Buccheri, welcome to the inaugural episode of the Education Matters podcast.
Well, thanks. Thank you for inviting me.
I wanted to start with you because I felt it would be really the most authentic way to start, because you, more than anybody, have emphasized the importance of education to me for years and years and years. And as I was preparing for this, I went through some of my notes I've taken when I've sat in your lectures over the years, and I found this one quote that I think really encapsulates the spirit of the podcast and really a lot of what I want to talk to you about today. And the quote goes, "Education is fundamental to a just society. it is what builds social cohesion. Can you start by describing the role that education has had in your life? And I'd like to start young. I'd like to start with where and when you grew up and what your education was like.
Well, I was born in Sicily, but at the age of 5, my mother and I emigrated to Venezuela to join my father. And I lived with my parents for 5 years in Venezuela. And I think I did up to grade 4 in Spanish. So my native language was Spanish, actually. And then we went back 5 years later, and I entered the Italian school system. And I studied from grade 5 there to grade 13 when I passed the state entrance examination to go to university. I actually won a scholarship, but then I decided, for a number of reasons, to join my parents and my brother, who were emigrating to Canada. And so I came with them to Canada at the age of 20 in 1970. And after working for a couple of years, learning English, I enrolled at U of T, where I studied foreign languages and literature, including Italian and Spanish. I did some French. I received a BA in 75, and then an MA in 76, and a PhD in Italian literature, U of T, also in 1984. When actually 2 years before that, I joined the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at York University on a 3-year contract. And then when I finished the PhD, I was given a position as an assistant professor in tenure stream. And I got tenure in 1989. And I worked at York until I retired in 2021.
So I'll come back to your time as a professor, because I do want to dig into that. But I'm wondering if you can start by telling the audience a little bit about what it was like to grow up both in Venezuela and Italy. Like how did you play as a child?
Well, actually, I had a very happy childhood, both in Venezuela, Caracas, and in Sicily, just outside. We lived just outside Syracuse. Total freedom in both cities, in Caracas and in Syracuse. I would go to swimming pool in Caracas by myself with my friends. My parents gave me, a lot of freedom. And the time where we lived in Caracas was very safe. Same thing in Sicily. Spent a lot of time in the farmhouse where my grandparents lived and worked, not too far from the beach, from the age of about 12 until I actually came to Canada. I spent 3 months with them in the countryside, So my childhood was very happy.
When it comes to your formal education, what was that like?
Well, my mother, who was a very bright person, could not go past grade 6. Her parents couldn't afford to send her to school. It was too expensive and it was out of town. So she always insisted that the way out of both poverty and the burden of ignorance was to be educated. I mean, my mother would read the Divine Comedy, would read major novels by novelists such as Alessandro Manzoni. So she wanted me to go to school, and she made sure that I did.
I can't even imagine what a typical day would be like in Sicily. But what was it like when it comes to your actual learning? What do you remember loving to learn?
Well, when I finished grade 8, I had a choice of what I think in Canada are called vocational schools or more academic high schools. And I chose Liceo Classico, where you do classical studies as well as science. I mean, I studied biology, chemistry, but also ancient Greek, Latin, Italian, French literature, history of art, we did religion as well. So when I started grade 9 in Syracuse, although at the beginning I had some difficulties adjusting to the curriculum, which was very hard. Imagine, studying Homer, let's say parts of the Odyssey in ancient Greek with a 3,000-page dictionary, having to translate Homer, and you're 16 years old. It took hours. I remember, sitting for 3-4 hours to translate 15 lines of the Odyssey. But what I learned was so exciting. By the way, we also did history of philosophy, part of the curriculum. And I fell in love with ideas, with literature. Basically, I've remained that kid that loved discovering ideas. And I'm 75, and I still love, whatever new ideas I come across or I read about or I hear about, even though at my age, how many more books can I read and study? But I will go to any length to know if there's something new, either in philosophy, science. If, for example, black holes really exist, are we inside a black hole? That kind of speculative thinking always fascinated me. And I will chase even the weirdest idea, because I truly believe that the world is, much more imaginative than our own imagination. Truly, anything is possible. And I've remained like that, curious for ideas.
Where do you think that curiosity came from?
I think my mother insisted that learning was fundamental. It gives you dignity, it gives you freedom. And she was right. I did achieve that. But I think I have shall we say, a natural tendency to be curious. And as you know, curiosity is probably the most important trait that differentiates us from other primates.
So, if I could move now from this early interest in literature and philosophy and general ideas to, as you described, your formal education here at the University of Toronto, and then into your time as a professor. Can you describe for the audience what did you teach, what did you publish, and what did you lecture on?
Well, my PhD was on a very important Italian writer called Italo Svevo, who has been called the Italian Proust. I think that's an exaggeration, but it was certainly one of the best Italian writers and Central European writers of the early 19th century. He died in 1928, if my memory serves me right. He was actually a friend of James Joyce, who spent a few years in Trieste. I found him fascinating. His mother was Catholic and his father Central European Jew that lived within the Italian nation state. I spent about 10 years working on him between the PhD and then some publications on Svevo. I also co-edited with a good friend of mine and colleague a book on Svevo, Between Modernity and Postmodernity, to which I also contributed. Then I became interested in other Italian authors on whom I published essentially book chapters or articles, writers like Pirandello or Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa. They're all 19th, 20th century writers. But because of my intellectual curiosity, I started studying theory, literary theory, from psychoanalytical theory to sociological theory, Marxist theory, also some other more contemporary theories like reader response theory and so on. So my fascination with theory has remained to this day, actually. Out of that experience, about 5-6 years later, meaning after I published the book on Svevo, I put together a major conference and I invited Umberto Eco, famous Italian semiotic expert, novelist. And out of that conference, I co-edited another book called The Power of Words. Then after that, I got more interested in Canadian multiculturalism. And I again organized a conference, and out of that, a book on the importance of accepting diversity, but within a context of some fundamental truths that keep us together. And then more recently, I've been spending several years now, since I retired, working on a book project titled Radical Humanism, based essentially on early Marx work on, for example, alienation, as well as the early Marx, who was essentially a humanist, And then as he gets into political economy, he moves away, at least theoretically, from what really inspired him to become a communist, which is his idea that everything revolves around human dignity. And his critique of capitalism is essentially a critique of the system tendency to dehumanize us.
Well, so I appreciate that background, and I wanted you to give that to the audience because all of that background, I think, informed your teaching practice. Now, I've been around schools all across Canada. I've been across all the universities here in former roles I've had. And despite the fact that you're my father, the reception to you as a teacher has been incredible. And this started when I would have teachers that were your former students, and they would always glow about having you as an instructor. What was it that you think you did different? Because as you told me many times, you never went to teachers college. You didn't learn how to be a teacher. But what was it about your teaching that made everybody react like that?
Well, I loved it. The idea of teaching, sharing ideas with young men and women, I've always found it exciting. Quite frankly, my experience as a student and as a professor required, in particular as a professor, that I write and publish. But if given a choice, I would have spent most of my life just simply teaching. It's kind of my bias. I know relatively well Greek philosophy in particular, the pre-Socratics, and all the way up to Epicurus. So from, let's say, the 6th century BC to the 3rd century. And even to this day, my idol remains Socrates, not Plato, although Plato is a giant, no doubt. And because Socrates would refuse to write, because truth is achieved according to Plato's Socrates, because we don't know exactly who Plato or who Socrates was. We know it through Plato. It's incredible, the power of dialogue, and therefore the power of direct teaching and feedback from the human being. And I think that lesson, which I internalized as a 16, 17-year-old, this mythological figure of Socrates walking around the agora in Athens, or just going to the Piraeus, which was the harbor of Athens, and walking there with that friends, and they would talk philosophy. What is truth? How do we know that this is true? And what is the connection between truth and the polis? Because that was the main concern of Socrates, or at least Plato's Socrates, which is, we live in the polis. Only in the polis life can have meaning, not in isolation, not in violence, in conquest, but in the polis, where at the time I believe 6,000 Athenians had the right to vote. They would congregate in the agora and make all decisions together.
So how much of this did you consciously bring into your teaching? Because
I think it was largely unconscious until I started thinking about it. getting older and older. I mean, I always, listen, I was teaching at York University until 2021. I was 72 years old, right? So I worked at York as a professor for 39 years, full time. I rarely remember any instance in which I dreaded going into class. I look forward to it. And it was tiring. I sometimes had 2-hour lectures to introduce, because I also taught Italian cinema for about 10 years, a course on Italian cinema, of course, the great classics, from Antonioni to Fellini and so on. And to me, it was like a gift.
Well, I want to go back to this idea of learning as a communal act, as a social act. Is that part of what you're getting at in that quote that I mentioned at the top, as education as fundamental to a just society and to social cohesion?
Well, I just alluded to the fact that Socratic philosophy is about not me, is about us. And as far as I understand the way Plato basically invented the figure of Socrates, it's a bit like the Gospels in relation to Jesus. Jesus never wrote anything. All we know about him is through the Gospels. All we know about Socrates essentially comes from Plato. Now, Plato, who is incredibly profound, and I mean, his work is even aesthetically valuable, condensed, I think, is what he learned from Socrates in the Republic. And the Republic essentially is, what's the best way to live together? Now, we should be aware that Socrates was put to death by democratic Athens, and that Plato had to leave Athens for over 10 years because he was at risk. He risked his life if he stayed in Athens, because he fell into the hands of tyrants, and there was an ebb and flow of democracy and tyranny. Like, the history of Athenian democracy, which lasted about 300 years, is a history, most people don't know that, of collapse of democracy, period of tyranny, reconstitution of democracy, collapse again, wars, imperialism, is all in constant flux, right? And so Plato in the Republic was trying to avoid those violent crises, which cost Athens not only economically, but also existentially and politically. And eventually their empire kind of fell apart. So the importance of the agora, meaning the place when we gather together and we decide on foreign policy, domestic policy, on what is right and what is wrong. And anyone could speak and try to convince the others that his way was better, could do so. Now, participatory democracy is no longer possible in our vast, modern cities and so on. But the point is that, decisions have to be reached rationally, and you have to be capable of accepting that you may be wrong.
So
These are the fundamental values.
Yeah. So what's the role in education in this process?
Well, education is crucial because, again, taking the example of Socrates and Plato, if you're not educated, you cannot properly use language. In fact, in the Republic, Plato insists on how important it is to study rhetoric, the use of language, which, by the way, the sophists knew very well how important language was, oratory, rhetoric, to control people's behavior or minds. So the first requirement is the capacity to use language properly. Let's say we have to make sure that our children study English and that English is prominent in our educational system. But then we have to teach them that it's not enough to know language well. We need to be able to think properly. And therefore, how do we learn to think properly? And this becomes the process that eventually, we call dialectics or dialogic, that the premise is quite simple and quite beautiful, is I do not have the truth at the beginning of the dialogue, and neither do you. But we have different positions, and these different positions will eventually come together to a higher level of understanding. And that's called really rationality, reason. In Greek society, the moment when Socratic philosophy emerges is the moment in which there is this profound conflict between, the Dionysian approach to life, which today we'll call follow your instincts, and the rational need to control instincts, because the violence emerges from irrational behavior rooted in instinct, which the Greeks call Dionysian approach, as opposed to the Apollonian one, which is the rational, aesthetic one that tries to do things in a rational way. Now, in the end, what we need is to balance the two. And by the way, to just skip into the future for a moment, that's what Nietzsche understood. Nietzsche understood that Socratic philosophy was about how to control instincts. Unfortunately, we developed a tendency to repress the instincts, and that creates neurosis. And this brings us to Freud. How do we deal with repression? How do we balance things out? Well, Socrates believed that would be done through dialogue, the agora. Plato didn't believe that. He actually comes up with a rather disconcerting idea, but also interesting. You cannot run the polis properly by telling always the truth, is what is called the noble lie. Even the deep philosophical truth that you achieve through Socratic thought may require that you lie to the citizens. Now, we can think about what the implications are. Implications are that in the end, Plato's Republic may point in the direction of an authoritarian society, because who decides what stories are told? And I use the concept of story as the proper one, because in the end, as you know very well, we have evolved as a storytelling animal. And so, which stories are we going to follow? Which story will be the dominant one? And I can be specific about this. For example, the Gospels is one of the most fascinating, stories that we've told each other, and is the birth of Christianity. Is that story true? Or is it mythological inventions of the human mind? I have no second thought saying that, Greek mythology is totally invented. There is no Zeus. There is no Athena. But we have serious problems because we've grown within the Judeo-Christian tradition to believe that, Jesus was not the incarnation of God, right?
So, we're verging on a different podcast right now, but let me pull this notion of storytelling back into education, because what I see, and it's pretty evident once you look, that there is a clash of narratives happening when it comes to education, and probably much more so in the United States than in Canada. But to you, what should this narrative about our hopes, our dreams in education, through education, what should that narrative sound like?
Well, I think that the story of education should be really a Socratic story, but without the Platonic twist in the Republic. But there is a risk in that. And the risk is that democracy can fall apart if we don't have civic commitment to protect it. So we have to teach the truth to our young generations. And we have to teach the fact that the truth is not something that you achieve and you kind of put it away. Is always being challenged by events, by the environment, cultural environment, political environment. So it comes down to really teaching civic engagement to our children. Let me give you an example. We teach everything, right? We give them, our young generations, all the technologies that we have. But we don't teach them to be politically involved, to be part of the political system. Actually, politics has a bad reputation. But, politics decide your life. Political economy, is at the heart of what we do. And this brings me to the idea, again, of which narrative to follow. Do we follow Greek mythology? Do we follow Socrates? Do we follow the Gospels? Which Gospels? Protestant ethic, Jewish ethics, or Marx, Paris manuscripts of 1844, where he speaks of how capitalism alienates human beings and takes dignity away from them. So I read Marx as a storyteller. Capital, Marx Capital, is telling the story of capitalism, whereas Plato's Republic is telling the story of Athenian democracy and its failures, right? So,
I mean,
what story we're going to...
Well, yeah, that's exactly what my question is. Who determines the story, and what story do we tell, and how do we tell it? So, I mean, these are deeply philosophical questions, but now let's overlay like a practical education system that you need to stand up, that it needs to have a reason for being. It needs to have a structure. So how do you go from these theoretic notions that if somebody's listening to this says, yeah, that all makes sense to me, but now what does that look like when it actually comes to the everyday business of teaching human beings to think?
The reason I propose that theoretical background is to be a background against which then we look at, what kind of university education should we have? What kind of high school curriculum should we have? And, I can speak with some degree of knowledge about university education. Now, since I was a student at the University of Toronto in the early 70s, the university has changed quite a lot. The university I went to was a very independent university. Provincial governments would not even dream of interfering with the way research was done, the way departments were organized, what would get priority funding or anything like that. And the university worked on the principle that you need certain programs, whether these programs lost money or made money was irrelevant. So that what you would do is, if you have a faculty of arts and sciences like U of T, if you made money with the science, you would transfer the money to the liberal arts, where usually you would lose money. And this was done internally. So the idea of the university was the idea of a place that knew what our young men and women needed to be good citizens. And it was, more than anything, it was implicit. You didn't even need to question it or discuss it. Now we're talking 1970s, 80s. The university system was well funded and it was growing because a lot of young people, educated young people, were needed, both for our democracy as well as, for our economy. Now things have changed since then. Without getting into too many details, we went from traditional liberalism to what is called now neoliberalism. The difference is radical. Neoliberalism politics put at the center of society the marketplace. Everything has to be conforming to the logic of the marketplace. This, over the years, has allowed governments to essentially control the university through funding. For example, you will get such an amount of money, but you cannot use it for anything but a school of engineering. Whereas before, as far as I understand the university, you know that I was in administration as college master for 10 years. So I had a good sense of how this funding works. So the idea that, let's say, the Schulich School of Business makes money, it's fine. But then we use the profit of the Schulich School of Business to support liberal arts. Well, that's no longer the case. Money is targeted. Uh, Universities are not well funded at all. You know, they're underfunded, significantly underfunded. And I think, in my view, it's because of this no longer liberal attitude, but this neoliberal attitude that universities should work like a company,
And so
efficiency.
beyond the university, what are the implications of this? Like, it sounds like you want to prioritize liberal education or the arts, I should say. Why is that?
Well, against the background of what I said before, to have a good society, you need good citizens. And to have good citizens, you need educated citizens. Now, what does it mean to be an educated citizen? It means to be able to think rationally, on your feet, with your head, with your mind. Now, do we have these citizens today? A minority, probably. What kind of society we live in? Why the funding goes in a certain direction and the liberal arts are neglected? Could it be because the liberal arts are dangerous in the sense that teach you autonomy and independence? Is there a connection between the strategies of all governments, provincial governments in Canada, to underfund certain aspects of higher education and fund those that, for example, create labor for certain aspect of the economy? I don't know how to give more examples, but imagine that the government does research and decides that they have a need for more family doctors. So what does the government do? And it is logical, or should do and will do, is open medical schools that will give us more family doctors. Now, and this is a fact, our democracy is in crisis also because participation has declined significantly. I don't know exactly the numbers, but I would bet that, of eligible voters in Canada, the federal election that decides who goes to power, there is participation lower than 60%. Where are the other 40?
These, I think nowadays, not even that hard to identify these types of problems. But again, the question I would ask is, how do we make improvements, right? How and say, like, the majority of the listeners here will be involved in the K-12 system as administrators, as sort of ed tech leaders. They're listening to this and they agree with these problems and analysis, but it's like, where do you start? It always seems that the problem is bigger than everyone's individual focus or individual capacity to make change. So what are the key drivers that you would point to improve the educations for the most amount of citizens possible?
Well, if I were to use the language of yesterday, I would say join a political party, because decisions about the economy are essentially made at the political level. But nowadays, I would use a different term. I would say create group agency, groups that will act in a way that this position that I'm advocating for would become significant and would become large and would participate in the political process. I know this sounds also abstract, but
Well, not really. I mean, nowadays
look,
people say you build community, right? So
look,
that's one of the objectives here too.
When I was young, both in Italy and here, I was part of the NDP, Social Democratic Party, because I thought that through that party, we could create what I call now group agency and make a difference. Now, historically, most Canadians know that the reason we have healthcare for everyone, universal healthcare, is because of the CCF, the party that preceded the NDP, that fought for that. So, what's happening now? Education is underfunded. Healthcare is underfunded. The liberal arts are dying in the universities. The universities now are in serious economic troubles. So, to put it simply, you need to be involved in politics. So education is not an island, If I want to use another metaphor, is part of an archipelago. It must be connected to politics, must be connected to economics, must be connected, to community. So it's not that the educational system exists in isolation. And I don't think this is part of the approach in the curriculum. I mean,
let me ask you a question in a different way. If you look forward into the future, and let's do this like medium term, we'll call 50 years into the future, and then long term beyond that. What do you see education looking like in 50 years from now and then beyond that? The good, the bad, the ugly.
Well, I really cannot think that far into the future, but since you chose the number 50 years into the future, let me try another theoretical approach to this. We live in a system right now that I described with the term neoliberalism. Has brought us globalization, perhaps even some prosperity, although most of it went to the infamous 1%. But it's not a good system. I cannot get into details. Maybe we can do a podcast on that too in the future. But according to some quite brilliant and respectable theorists, the expectation is that neoliberalism may begin to falter as a system. Perhaps we already see the first signs of the crisis of globalization now, even by reflecting on Trump's victory in the United States. So, according to this well-known scholar called Emanuel Wallerstein, between 30 to 50 years from now, his sense is that the system will enter a crisis. The good news is that if you have group agency, when the crisis begins to manifest itself, you can actually have a political impact. So that's what I'm trying to articulate now, discussing with you, which is we have to look at the educational system as part of a larger system, which is social, political. And in this particular historical period is neoliberalism, which simply is a system that put at the center of society the marketplace, the economy, and everything else has to adapt to that. Now, I think that system will enter a crisis, and educational experts or people who really care about our youth will have a chance to have an impact on the political system. So we need to think about group agency, or to use the old term, a political party that would prioritize liberal education as the foundation of a democratic society. And of course, that doesn't mean that the educational system has to neglect the needs that our economy has. We need engineers, we need plumbers, we need electricians, we need people that can program computers, we need scientific research, and we need to use all the tools that technology can give us to improve the human condition. And look, none of these things that I've been talking about require a PhD or even an MA or a BA. They require a good elementary and high school education, which now is required up until 18 years of age, if my memory serves me right. Those are formative years. Look, my formative years were not, most of them at least, not at U of T in the 70s, but they were between grade 8 and grade 13 in Italy, where my mind was shaped to consider knowledge as essential for a good life.
If I gave you a magic wand, so to speak, to make any changes to the education system, what would you do?
Well, the first thing I would do is full funding of any good ideas coming from universities, from all fields of universities. I would make a priority. Look, there are two things, and nobody would argue against this. It's actually obvious. Two things that are central to a good society. And the first one is education, knowledge, because everything else will follow that. And the second one is we ought to take care of the human being first. The dignity of a human being should not be diminished or taken away because we cannot afford a good healthcare system or a good educational system that would be open to everyone, that would discriminate no one. From that point of view, I'm against totally private schools and private hospitals. Education and healthcare should remain public and well-funded before any tax credit or breaks can be given to corporations or economic activities. You take away those two things and you lose your humanity. So full funding, and then as I said clearly, make sure that we, at the end of our educational system. We have an educated citizen that knows why and for what she or he is voting for. I really insist on the political side. By the way, just a little linguistic information. In Greek, in ancient Greek, politics would be better translated as social commitment. Politeia, from which politics come, it means society, right? So political engagement etymologically means social engagement because we're social beings by nature. We like to be together. Right.
It's interesting. You couple that with, the etymology. Do you remember the etymology for school?
That right now, no. You do though.
Leisure.
Right.
So you couple those two things together, and I think you have a very different system indeed. This is probably a good place to wrap it, Dad. But what I'd like to do to end every podcast is to ask the guests to recommend a podcast, a book, a video, a movie. Doesn't have to be one of each, but recommend something that you think the audience would enjoy.
Well, a book that I loved, which was published, I think, last year, is by a Greek economist who was briefly, I think, Minister of Finance in Greece in 2015 or 2017, when Greece went through its political and economic crisis. His name is Varoufakis, and the book is Techno-Capitalism. And the reason I suggest this book is that, according to Varoufakis, at least, that technology has taken over capitalism. And because I know the theories behind, philosophical theories behind technology, as well as Marx theories, I think this is a very, very dangerous, how should I describe, metamorphosis of capitalism. The implications can be really scary.
Yeah, he talks. It's an interesting work. He talks about cloud capital, as in those that control the cloud in the various forms are now going to control the entire economic system. So that's a really interesting one. Anything else?
There is a professor of political science. I cannot remember his first name, but his last name is Wolf, Professor.
Richard Wolf.
Richard Wolf, who is brilliant. And his podcasts are really instructive. They really teach you profound ideas in a very linear way. And he does good analysis of what's going on, in particular, in the United States. But also, he speaks about imperialism and globalization. Of course, I would also recommend some of the podcasts, but I haven't seen any recently.
Yeah,
or some
his podcast is called The Economic Update.
Right.
Since you were always a lover of literature and poetry, any poetry that you'd recommend? I don't think there's going to be too many folks that I interview that are going to recommend a poet or poems.
Well, one of the, I think, most powerful poets of modern America, by modern I mean from the 1800s until now, and who has written powerful things about democracy, is, guess who? Song of Myself by Walt Whitman.
Mm-hmm.
I would highly recommend it. Song of Myself, the original first edition, which is not very long, which is part of Leaves of Grass, right?
With that, you see, that wasn't so bad. It was a good conversation. Thanks for taking some time to do this.
Well, listen, let's do more because I'm getting old. I won't be around for, well, I mean, maybe a few more years, but let's do this. I like it.
Thanks. This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. Until next time.